From Hong Kong, this is Mea Culpa, the Lessons Learned from Startup podcast, based on the Postmodern Conference, where founders, investors, lawyers, and mentors share their stories about working on, with, or for startups. Today, we have Remi Caron. He's a well-known technical advisor. He's the former CIO of the Telegraph Media Group, the CTO of the New Motion startup, and CTIO now from Versa, a local startup in the Netherlands that's doing travel-related solutions. So welcome, Remi.
Thank you, Jeff. Good to be here.
Remi, how did you make your way into startups? Because you were a technical network solution guy, right?
Yep. So I found my way into the startup world basically in Hong Kong, to be honest. When our mutual friend Stephen Forte was doing an accelerator in Hong Kong, and he invited me over together with Richard Campbell to come visit and check out the operation and check out the startup world, how that was evolving around the notion of Eric Ries with the lean startup and that movement back in the day. And I was immediately grabbed by the dynamics of that scene, by the enthusiasm of the people, by the almost liberating way of starting a business, I would say. So I came back I came at the era where you had piles and piles of documents and spreadsheets to prove that your business was anything but viable. So that was quite liberating, and that's also where we met, Jeff, in that era.
Correct. And how was it for you as a technical person, indeed, to see that there is something like going out and validate hypothesis before you start coding anything?
I actually that was one of the liberating things. It was so because normally you would start writing code immediately and working on the big picture, never really realizing that validating before you start could actually be beneficial. So the one of the eye openers, I think, was actually the whole validation point. You got an idea. Before you do anything else, you validate whether or not the idea has legs for the intended target audience. And this is also where you do the most amazing discoveries, that either your idea is quite valid and you can start building something very small to further test it, or it's crap and you need to scratch it and you need to go back to the drawing board, or you're onto something that with some pivots might actually turn into something. So it's it's actually quite eye-opening that before you start spending a tremendous amount of hours and resources and so forth to gain knowledge of the idea before you actually start spending money, believing in the dream that you came up with. So it is it's one of the transitions that is most likely the biggest, but also I caught on to that quite quickly and saw the value of doing that and never looked back since.
While you were doing that, when you were seeing that, and of course at that point you had a corporate job.
Yep.
What changed for you at that point also for next ventures that you went into from that moment on? Because I can understand that your perspective of just being the technical guy and more into the business side of it and the validation of it. What were you at that point looking for when you were going into your next challenge? Because I also know that you do a lot of advising. Currently you're working for a startup. What made you at that point, you can find it interesting, but what made you really consider start working for a startup? Because you can find it interesting and you can resonate with it, but it doesn't mean that you want to give up your comfy corporate job and jump into startups.
Right. So I've always been entrepreneurial by heart. So all the corporate lineups that I've done always were from my own company. So I was always done interim jobs at larger firms, but also at smaller firms. One of the things that what I did is I took the line of thinking and the attitude, if you will, from the startup scene also into the corporate world, and because the same problems, if you want to refer to it as a problem, the same line of thinking, and maybe even more so, exists in the corporate world. So they start building ideas they have immediately because they have the resources, they got the IT people sitting around. But the funny part is that everybody inside those companies is fighting for resources because they all have great ideas and they all want to get started with those great ideas and start building them. So there's a huge claim on the IT department as a whole, which makes them scarce by definition, right? So the same issue you have there. So if you then insert startup thinking, as in, okay, the idea sounds great, but let's validate. And validating it from a corporate perspective is potentially easier than validating something that doesn't exist yet, or is really from the ground up, because corporate life already has a customer base. So validating a new idea or a new plan or a new initiative or a new site or app or whatever it is you want to build is quite easy because you can tap into that existing customer base. So it caught on for me immediately, and I liked the startup scene because it's you got a little bit more freedom, right? Also, you got more scarcity, right? Money is scarce, resources are tight, hours in a day are limited. Even though you can work as much as you can, but still there's so much stuff that needs to be done in the startup scene that there always seems to be a lack of time. And in the corporate world, it's slightly different, but there's another form of scarcity. So reaching out to the corporate world or the corporates that I worked for at the time and inserting, let's say, the startup way of approaching projects within that scene was also quite interesting. And also sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't, because there is institutions that are, and especially the bigger finance world, that are very reluctant to jump into that almost, in their eyes, non-steerable way of working, right? There's no spreadsheet, there's no plan, there's no milestones, not at the beginning at least, where people can have quote unquote sensible discussions about how that goes in the corporate world. But if you actually do break through, you see people start to embrace the different approach to new ideas, plans, apps, or whatever else. And it actually also brings speed to normally slower companies because of their size. So, and then jumping into the startup scene altogether, because currently I'm doing the majority of the things that I do is startups, one or two, is because I enjoy the environment so much more than I really than the corporate, the old-fashioned corporate world, that I in the end started to lean more towards the startup scene than towards the corporate world. Every now and then I'm still doing advisory, like you said, for corporate worlds, but usually I then start to bring in the startup way of working, and that's also why they now sort of like recognize me and start to approach me for, because it seems very simple to make that transition, but in real life it is not.
Yeah, because I can understand, beside of the fact that it is a changing mindset, there's also a thing as doing corporate gigs. Then yeah, you're relatively secure about your income. But when you're doing a startup, then quite often, what you said, you have constraints when it comes to budget. So quite often there's of course there's a sweat equity part in it, but your cash flow usually goes down. How was it for you to change that mindset, and maybe at that point the appetite, and how was your environment, friends, family, etc., reacting on that you're not going for that comfy corporate world, but then more into like the more insecure, the more riskful endeavors?
Let me answer it like this. So if you do what you like, you never go to work. And if you do what you like, you are a happier person also in your private life. So, and I'm not saying money is not important, right? Because you need to make a living and you need to pay the mortgage and all that other fun stuff, like everybody else. I'm not born in a bed of money. I didn't win the lottery, so I need to work. I need to work for my mortgage like everybody else. But since work is such a large portion of your daily endeavor, the joy that it gives you and the energy that it gives you prevails for me. So if you get to a level of income that satisfies your needs, and then the rest is being added with energy or joy or whatever you want to phrase it, by the things you really enjoy doing, I think you should declare yourself a happy camper in this world. And could I earn more money when doing corporate gigs? Yeah. Would I be a happier person? The answer is most likely no.
And you're happier now, but what also did it do with your mental being, your state of mind? Because quite often when it comes to mental health, a lot of people are talking about that corporate jobs quite comfy but can be very stressful. But on the other hand, startups can be very stressful because there's a huge risk and not everybody can handle that risk. So what did it do for you when it comes to your mental health, and what do you do to mitigate that risk for yourself and make it more of a healthy life for you?
Um, well, the thing is that I started my first business when I was 26, so I've always been entrepreneurial. So I think if you don't have an entrepreneurial spirit by design, you most likely shouldn't jump into this world. What I like about the startup scene and all the difficulties that come with it is the fact that you need to think from constraints basically every day, and constraints vary from time to time. And I strongly believe that those constraints actually make you creative, and I like that creative process. I like the fact that I don't know how next week is going to look like. If there is at the end of the budget that you currently have, is there something worth fighting for? Is there a potential to get additional funding or whatever else you might run into? And that forces you to be on your toes and creative all the time. And I like that adrenaline rush, if you want to phrase it as such, that you're really pushed to the limit by circumstance and not by other humanly designed artifacts, so to speak, which is more common in the corporate world, which is there for a reason. So I'm not trying to bash the corporate world, but I think there's a lot to be gained in the corporate world to adapt more of the startup entrepreneurial spirit in the way they do their projects, for them to be more successful as well. So I don't mind the stress. I don't mind the fact that you don't really know sometimes where this is going. But if you don't feel comfortable with that, then this might not be the scene for you. So it takes a certain mindset, I think, from the people that actually do this in order to deal with the potential stress or discomfort that it might bring in other people's lives.
Okay. One of the first foray, if I'm correct, into startups was working together with me on Surround app, the Chinese social media for people who cannot read Chinese.
Yep.
How was that for you? Just be honest and straightforward. That experience working with a group of people remotely and being responsible for the technology.
So remotely was not necessarily new to me. I've done some remote work in before we met, when we did the outsourcing or nearshoring, if you want to phrase it as such, in Cairo for customers in the Netherlands and so forth. Being responsible for technology wasn't necessarily new either. The startup scene and the way that we approached it was very new to me. So this is where I learned a lot from the setup, in the way you structured the company at the time, the people that were around. I remember I think I'm pretty sure I was the oldest one on the team even. And
Correct.
yeah, by far even. So that was fun. That was fun to look at, and I think the bigger experience was that basically at the end of it, that the conclusion that we draw is that at first it looked like it kicked off, and then it sort of like flatlined, pretty much, and then we discovered by analysis that the people that actually used the tool was a totally different audience than we expected it to be. And that was quite funny. So even though we did some validation beforehand, throughout the course of building the whole thing, we made a totally different discovery than we anticipated. I think even for you, that was quite surprising. And
No, correct.
the other thing is that then when we discovered that the relative ease with which we sort of like decided to put an end to it, without a grudge, without hard feelings, without feeling sorry for ourselves, was to me quite eye-opening in general. So for me, I think I experienced a lot in the surround app scene. Basically, a bunch of stuff that you normally would experience in one or two startups in or so, or a couple of pivots in. So I think we went on a quite a roller coaster that was quite a learning experience from the get-go.
Yeah, definitely for me. Like I've been an entrepreneur almost all my working life, but doing like a real like scalable startup in that sense, and the definition of a startup was also for me lots of learnings there. That's correct, and indeed we found out that the market and the people who are using it were indeed different. I wrote a significant blog post about it. I'll put that blog post in the show notes for people who want to read more details about it. But then at one point you became the CTO of the New Motion. Was it a startup? Could you define it as a startup?
Well, the thing is, I think when I joined the New Motion, they were a scale up. If you look at the size of it, if you look at the operations at the time, it was pretty much on the inside still as a startup, still trying to find the real target, the real deal for the New Motion as a player in the charging station field. So there was a lot of experimenting going on. Basically, all the things that you normally would do in a startup phase was still going on the inside. So they kept that mojo of exploring into different angles or side effects that played a role in the charging scene at the time. And they were still going at it as a startup. So you could also see it as a mixed bag, where the mainstream thing, building the charging station, adding clients to the customer base, doing the clearinghouse functionality, and so forth, was pretty much established. But they were venturing into other areas where they still had the startup mojo going. So that was kind of a mixed bag in that sense, and that was another great experience to see, because every startup has to dream to become a scale up, and in the end even wants to become a corporate or a unicorn. By which you grow into the world where you try to stay away from very far, very hard. So everybody has to dream to become the thing they want to stay away from, which is an interesting thing on its own. So yeah, that was something in the middle, and that was another thing that then you start to see that the people that were there from the early days might not be the people that you need in the second phase, because some of the people are just, I'm just going to qualify it as startup material. They just want to do startups all the time. By the time it starts to solidify and really gets a direction, they lose interest, because they are just so creative by heart that they need to stay on that creative path in order to be who they want to be. Right. So then this is where the transition starts, from other people coming in, more people coming in, people from the startup days leaving because they want to join another startup, because they just need to get that creative feeling back again. So that was an interesting stage to see, actually.
And what was your biggest challenge there, if you're allowed to talk about it?
Yeah, I can say a few things about it. Well, the challenge there was to also find my own path in. Okay, so this part of the company is actually established, and we can steadily grow this into something more sustainable, bigger, money making part of it. This is where you start to see procedures coming in, milestones coming in, commitments to customers coming in, suppliers, and so forth. So you get into a quote quote regular company kind of thing. And at the same time, there was so much more to explore that a portion of the day was filled with shaping a company, and a portion of the day was filled with still being startup-y and exploring things like vehicle to grid, with load balancing, all those things that were a topic at the time. Um, so splitting yourself between growing a company into a quote quote real company and still keeping that startup mojo for another portion of the company going, that's quite challenging, because then you're context switching all the time in your own head, and also in the actions that you undertake, but
Mhm.
also trying to explain that inside the company, because it's quite technology driven, uh, and carrying out the strategy and the vision from the company with the technology in order to make that all happen. That was quite a balancing act.
Okay.
And
And
this is
then,
basically also the moment where I decided to start the MBA, to better understand how a CFO looks at the world, how a CEO looks at the world, because technology is something that I've done all my life, so that's almost natural to me. So how
Mhm.
do you then convey the message in such a dynamic environment to people that don't have your glasses on, and look at the world in a different way?
Is an MBA the way to do that?
Mm. There's a couple of ways to do it. So an MBA was something that was on my wish list forever, because I'm also a learner. I like to learn new things, and I had my mindset of one day doing that. But it did help me, to be honest. It did really help me to understand the world of the CFO, the world of the CEO, why they look at things in a certain way. Is there other ways to do it? Most likely, yes. But I choose to do it in this way.
Yeah, because sometimes but it may be also because of my background as a commercial engineer. So I already have a significant basis when it comes to the things that are being taught in an MBA. But quite often I have to say, with the angel investments that I've done so far,
Hmm.
I could have done an MBA. Then at that point, I had learned how to make a discounted cash flow calculation. And now
Hmm.
I'm out of the money, but still don't know how to make a discounted cash flow calculation.
Right.
So, and I'm not one to say that an MBA is only learning how to make a discounted cash flow calculation,
No.
but when it comes to the practical stuff, what you need is basically starting a business. Would you suggest for people to do an MBA and then after that start a business, or you would
No.
say something else?
No. So the way I did is I started my first business when I was 26. I started the MBA when I was, I think, 44. So in my opinion, an MBA makes sense if you've got a couple of years of work experience, potentially even entrepreneur experience on your belt, and then it all makes more sense to you. And I also started the MBA with a specific trajectory in mind, because what I wanted to get out of the MBA is how I went into it. I did a modular executive MBA, so I choose the modules that sort of like fitted my needs to bring myself to I wouldn't say a different level, but a different level of understanding of my peers in the boardroom. So I started out as a COBOL programmer on a DEC Mini in 1988. So I worked my way through all the layers, if you will. And so I didn't start with a very significant management or board experience or anything of the sort. So everything that I've learned in life, I usually learned by doing it wrong first time around, and maybe even second time around. But later on in life, after work experience, entrepreneurial experience, a company that defaulted, um, that all that combined with the MBA made me a more complete professional in the boardroom, I think. And for peers that work for me to judge, of course, but I think that is actually true.
Okay. By the way, if you still know Cobalt, I know that you can make some money in there because they're getting rarer and rarer as programmers, and there are still some legacy systems in, especially in the financial industry, when it comes to Cobalt. If I would basically now put you in front of a Cobalt solution, would you still be able to navigate your way around and solve problems, or is it too far gone?
I think it's far gone, but actually not so long ago I saw a listing written in Cobalt, and I really still understood what it was intended to do. So I can still read it. Am I still proficient in it like I was back in the day? No. So, but I think if I really put my mind to it, I can probably catch on to it again, because I never really left the programming machine. I still program a little bit. So I'm doing a little bit of Golang. I do a little bit of Python. And the reason for that is I enjoy coding too much to let it go altogether. And I use it to do prototyping. So I prototype something when I got a crazy idea, prototype a little bit, and then I hand it off to people that basically code every day for a living. But I'm still quite comfortable as a code editor. And what that brings me is that if you are talking to developers or you're talking to product owners or whatever else, the fact that you understand what they're doing and that you have lived their life and that you basically can also help debug if need be, gives you way more leverage with the technical team that you're trying to achieve something with. So I will probably try to hold on to that as long as possible. It's really enjoyable to do. So and it gives me that extra bit of leverage with the technical people that are building the solution, whatever it is you're building.
Talk about that. Some of the listeners may be business co-founders looking for a technical co-founder. What would your tips be for people that are looking for technical co-founders or technical people to join them and help them build out that great idea or that validated idea that they have?
Right. So my take on the matter would be, pick somebody who actually understands what's going on. Don't go for a CTO that just wants to manage people. So a technical co-founder really needs to understand the technology that you're trying to work with. And if you could also say that if he or she doesn't understand the technology at day one, they should at least be eager enough to dive in and understand or try to figure out other ways to do it. But if you're at the early stages and you're looking for a technical co-founder, make sure he or she really is technical and not just a textbook technical person. Because you know very well, Jeff, that especially when you need to pivot, or especially when you're looking for quick fixes or libraries or tools that you might want to use or whatever else, if you don't understand that landscape, you're never going to get there. And especially in the early days, somebody who has done it, who has lived through that scene, is probably going to be more helpful to you.
Yeah, although learning on the job is one part, but you have to have that basis when it comes to the groundwork. I also quite often give the advice that as a business co-founder, do as much as possible by yourself. There are actually now so much non-code or low-code solutions out there that you can build your own MVP. And then I always say, like, do that first, and then of course it will break, and by the time you have, I don't know, a call center with 20 people working for you because it's almost for you not possible to code that, and then at that point you go to a technical person, say like, hey, we have this problem, it breaks here, it breaks there, and we could save up 95% of the people in the call center if you just be able to code this. Then at that point, in my point of view, technical people get interested because then they know if they code something, it's definitely going to be used. And then they say like, oh, and they look at your screen and say, you know what, step aside, let me solve this for you. Yeah. And that's the hook. I think that you have to create as a business co-founder to get that technical people on board.
Totally true. And so another thing that I in the startup scene, I'm totally with you on this. And the what I see in the corporate world is that they all have the urge to disrupt or be different, right? And what you see happening is then they start hiring a CTO or somebody with technical knowledge, and they are looking for somebody who's already worked in that field before. And I think that's one of the biggest mistakes you can make if you want to if you really want to disrupt your industry. Hire from outside your industry, because you need something with a different. You need somebody with a different mindset. You don't need somebody who's done this before and is going to come work for you and change 15% of the things that are happening because he or she just have a different vision on how to execute. You need something with a different pair of eyes that's going to ask the questions nobody asks anymore in that industry, but also brings outside knowledge from another industry that might actually lead to something. Right. So if you really want to disrupt from a corporate space, hiring somebody who doesn't know anything about the industry that you're in might be very beneficial. Feels counterintuitive, but it's really going to help. And if you look at my resume, I've been all over the place. I've been in many different industries on purpose, and I do see myself using bits and pieces from all the industries that I've worked in on any gig that I go into going forward, and that has been beneficial. Let's put it that way.
Talking about industry, this is a nice bridge and handover. You're currently the Chief Technology and Innovation Officer of Versa, which is
Yep.
a travel startup or company.
Yep.
We're already like almost 2 years in, or at least 1.5 years in a COVID situation.
Yep.
And a travel solution startup.
Yep.
I imagine that was not the easiest ride so far. So can you, in broad strokes, tell what you did before COVID hit, what you did while COVID was hitting, and what you're doing right now?
Yep. So we did a major pilot with a large European airline, which is not to be disclosed, successfully, and we would commercially launch the luggage tracker in May last year, and that didn't happen, obviously. I remember coming back from my team in Poland on a lot plane, and when we're descending into Amsterdam, they were announcing that the first COVID victim was detected in Warsaw at that very moment. And I remember walking through Schiphol Airport with my bag on the way to the parking lot, calling my partner and saying, "We need to pivot into cargo because luggage is going to be bogged down for nobody knows how long." I didn't have a glass ball, but everything that I could sense is that there would be a lockdown and travel would be banned for whatever else. And we did. So we pivoted into cargo. We created a new tracker with additional sensors that were not available on the luggage tracker. Ventured into cargo and are on the verge of going in there quite big with a couple of big customers that have tested the new tracker. So we took all the capabilities that we've built into the luggage tracker and brought that onto the cargo space, and that generated a lot of traction. There was already interest from the cargo space in the luggage tracker, but it was specifically designed for luggage, so it would do a couple of things okay-ish in the cargo space, but it wasn't targeted at that. So now we created a V2 that's actually targeted for cargo, and that's kicking around big time.
That's a great insight you had when you were walking at Schiphol Amsterdam Airport when the first COVID case was announced.
It was already so that was the first in Poland, right? So globally, it was already sort of a pandemic. So it was not based on one case.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How long did it take for you to pivot from a luggage tracker to a cargo tracker?
So mentally, it didn't take long, but building hardware is always tedious. So building hardware took me roughly half a year to redesign the PCB, adding more sensors, finding the components that you need, doing the new casing, having the IP86 being a certification, all that kind of fun stuff. But platform-wise, we were ready to onboard other trackers anyway, so that was designed that way. So luckily, so we didn't have to redo the platform. We had to do some alterations to the firmware running on the tracker because there was more sensors on board, but we could lean on previous efforts from the luggage space. So I would say, all in all, it took me roughly around 6 to 8 months to get a fully operational luggage tracker, cargo tracker, ready to be promoted and marketed and tested, and POCs being run with and so forth. And the team was actually great. They also understood the why, and they caught on to the cargo way of thinking quite quick. So that was really helpful.
It sounds like you always had unlimited runway, but I can imagine that adding on another 1.5 to 2 years to revenue could really strain your runway. How did that discussion go, and how did you solve that?
Yeah, so we went back to the shareholders and go like, this is happening. We could either hit the pause button and wait until luggage kicks in again, or we could pivot into cargo, and we had a rough sketch of where this would go, how that would look like. And they all believed in the idea, and they provided us with a runway to actually make this happen. So it starts with having the idea and having the plan and having the vision on how to do this, also being backed up with the interest we already had from the cargo space when we were doing the luggage tracker. Some LOIs floating around, and the transparency that we had towards the shareholders from day one. Also, the good, the bad, and the ugly in the luggage space was always shared. That wasn't an easy ride to get from zero to where we were at that moment either. So we had a lot of trust and leverage with the existing shareholders to get this done, and so that also helped, because you're right. You can have a great idea, you can have a great pivot, but if there's no runway, that will die nevertheless.
That's great to hear. It's great to hear that you were able to build that trust, and you had investors and shareholders that were able to foot that bill and were sharing your vision and the extended runway. So, what's the most valuable advice that's ever given to you?
Embrace the negative comments. So it's never easy to hear people say that they don't like what you're doing. And even also me, I start to get defensive feelings on the inside, and the urge to verbalize those. But really take it on the chin, chew on it, sleep over it, and then be truthful to yourself. People are not out there to bash you normally, but if they dislike what you're doing, or they have good arguments that it is not really what you yourself think it's going to be, take it to heart, because even though it sounds harsh, the intentions are correct, and if you really are open to listen to it and embrace those quote quote negative comments, that will actually help you forward.
That's great advice. What's something that's not a secret, but most people don't know about you?
I don't know, but I think the fact that I went to a default with a company is something that not everybody knows about me, which combined with the MBA really shaped the way I look at things, and the signs that I see on writing on the wall, if you will, based on those experiences, is things that's probably things people don't. It's not in my resume, but I lived through it. I solved it in the end, and it was not the most pleasant time of my life, but it was definitely one of the times where I learned a lot about people, learned a lot about how things work, how the world works, how people look at things, and yeah. So I think that's something that people probably not everybody knows about me. I know you know, but not everybody knows. I don't make a secret out of it. And I'm happy to share the experiences that I went through, and also the learnings that I took from it. But that would be one of the secrets hiding in plain sight, I would say.
Okay. Thank you very much. I want to thank you for your valuable insights and your sharing of your lessons learned in startups. For the listeners, although the rating system of podcasts is hideous, if you like the Mea Culpa series, you can rate this podcast with 5 stars and motivation for the makers. Thanks to Mizuho Crowdbrain in Hong Kong for being the venue sponsor for this episode, and thanks to Copy Ventures for making this series possible. If you have any suggestions and guests, please reach out to us. We're happy to invite other people too for this podcast. This is Jeffrey Brewer. Go out and build something meaningful. Thank you, Remi.
Thanks, Jeff, for having me.